It always hurts when one of our legends passes away. Wes Craven, George Romero, and Tobe Hooper were three of the big four that horror enthusiasts grew up watching. While the movies that came out close to the time of their passing never quite matched up to their all-time classics, it was always a shot to the gut when they were suddenly gone. Actors are no different, and while Tony Todd has over 240 credits to his name,
and you don't even want to fuck with that, McDaddy,
Daniel Robitaille, the Candyman, will always be his most recognizable and terrifying character. The movie was a success and set off a small franchise and a larger-than-life character, but who was almost cast as the titular hook-wearer? And how did Todd feel when he had to pass the torch? Get in front of a mirror and say his name 5 times as we find out what happened to Candyman.
Candyman.
Clive Barker is no stranger to working on projects, both original and adaptations. But when he released his seminal Books of Blood in 1984 and 1985, it was just an outlet for his creative freedoms. His first movie would be Underworld in 1985. No, not the Kate Beckinsale one. But his first adaptation, and one that he hated, would be Rawhead Rex in 1986. While he would direct a few of his own works, like Hellraiser, Nightbreed, and Lord of Illusions, one of his most famous adaptations would be written and directed by someone else entirely. The Forbidden, one of the short stories included in Volume 5 of The Books of Blood, would eventually lead to Candyman in 1992. The film follows Helen Lyle, who is a student of semiotics, or the study of the meaning of signs, who finds herself obsessed in the Cabrini Green housing area of Chicago when she comes across the legend of Candyman. See, Candyman is a figure who terrorizes the area, and used to be a beloved painter in the 1800s. Unfortunately for Daniel Robitaille, he was also black, the son of a slave, and in love with a white woman, who he would later impregnate. The local lynch mob would capture him, cut off his hand, and have him killed by bee stings. Helen investigates further, which leads to a series of murders that connect to her. Candyman attacks her but kills her friend, psychiatrist, and even a dog in the projects that she was investigating. Helen bargains with the spirit and eventually dies while saving a young boy named Anthony. While she didn't actually commit any crimes, her legend is placed right along that of Candyman's, and she even comes back as a vengeful spirit herself to take the life of her douchebag former husband. The movie greatly expands on the short story, which is fewer than 40 pages. This is because a writer by the name of Bernard Rose read the story that discusses the poorer sections of Liverpool and transposed it to the racially charged streets of Chicago. He found that Cabrini Green, with its high crime and violence rates, and was fascinated that it was also surrounded by higher-end areas, so he could have his main character feel safe while still investigating. From this premise, Rose was able to not only make the character of Candyman black, but also give him a backstory that Barker willfully left out. Rose was able to deftly mix the racial tensions of the new area and add in a biracial love story to the proceedings that gave the film a timelessness. Bernard Rose was born in London, so the change from Liverpool to Chicago may seem strange at first, but while the original story does deal with segregation, Rose fell in love with Cabrini Green and the fact that it was an area that had people just trying to live their lives. The characters in this film would end up being much more afraid of the legend of Candyman, more so than the fear of crime or anything else inside their homes.
We hear you're looking for Candyman, bitch.
Rose had been a steady director for years before getting the chance to do this film. But he doesn't have a ton else on his resume that jumps out. He will always have Candyman, though. He even battled some of the controversy head-on that the movie had created. He was asked to appear before the NAACP, who, after reading the script, joked that they were unclear as to why they were even having this meeting. They thought that it was all in good fun and openly asked why a black man couldn't be a ghost, Jason Voorhees, or even Freddy Krueger. It would have been more offensive for someone to say that a person of color couldn't do that. The script generated a ton of excitement and came out of a chance meeting between Barker and Rose. after Barker had finished adapting his own work into the movie Nightbreed. Both Virginia Madsen and Tony Todd both lobbied hard to get roles, and would both end up as integral parts of the film, though it was almost very, very different. Madsen was originally going to play the part of Bernadette, but when the story and production moved to Chicago, it was decided to swap and have Bernadette be played by a black actress. That actress was Casey Lemons, and Madsen thought that she was out of a role. The original actress for Helen that was chosen was Alexandra Pig, who happened to be married to Bernard Rose. When she found out that she was pregnant, however, she dropped out, which allowed Madsen, who was good friends with Pig and the writer-director, to step back into the movie and into the main role. Had Madsen not wanted to or been unable to perform, the role would have been offered to a relatively unknown actress named Sandra Bullock. Candyman himself was almost very different, with Eddie Murphy being the first choice. He was seen as too small, and the 6'5" Tony Todd was able to step in and take the part. It was Todd who came up with much of the character's backstory as well. Part of the movie, 3 days to be exact, was actually filmed in Cabrini Green, with plainclothes police officers accompanying the cast and crew. While it was difficult emotionally, both Madsen and Tony Todd found a lot of value in it. According to some sources, local gang members were also used as extras to broker peace at the filming location. The same team that supplied the effects for Backdraft were tasked with creating the massive bonfire at the end of the movie, which also happened to take place in Cabrini Green. For the portrayal of Candyman, Todd wanted to play the character like a quote-unquote primeval boogeyman, and originally wanted an eye patch to go along with his hook. This is also why his footsteps make no sounds on film, so that he has an air of the supernatural firmly around him. Todd worked with effects man Bob Keane in crafting the look of Candyman. While the eye patch was a no-go, another change to the character was the right arm. At first, Keane wanted it to be a machine-controlled effect, but it was too clunky and also difficult for Todd to work with. That was changed into a hook that Keane crafted over the course of 3 hours, and overall, it was decided traditional practical effects were to be used rather than early computer or optical ones. Speaking of practical effects, the bees that have become so famous and tied to the character were very real. The production hired Norman Gary as the bee handler, and Gary was no stranger to being trusted in Hollywood. He was the man behind the scenes on such famous movies as The Deadly Bees, Fried Green Tomatoes, and My Girl. Over 200,000 honeybees were used in Candyman, and they kept them calm with a simulated queen bee pheromone. Most of the rest of the cast and crew also wore protective gear around them. I say most because Tony Todd went all in. He was able to secure in his contract that he would be paid $1,000 for every bee sting that he endured. He used a dental dam to stop the bees from going down his throat, but that is, in fact, all Tony Todd in that famous scene of the bees in his mouth. Virginia Madsen, on the other hand, needed special bees that would not sting, as she had a deadly allergy to them, but still wanted to do the scene where the bees go from Candyman to Helen. Further effort went into the relationship between Helen and Candyman, and that included the relationship between actors Tony Todd and Virginia Madsen. With Rose seeing this as very much a love story, he had the two actors take ballroom dance classes together so that they could become more intimate with each other in the hopes that it would show up on screen. For the interactions between the characters, Rose wanted to avoid the typical final girl screaming hysterically when in the presence of the killer, so a hypnotist was brought in. This process took about 10 minutes to prepare prior to filming the scenes, and Madsen would be placed into a trance-like state via a word that Rose and the hypnotist would come up with. One final character that gets lost in the shuffle of Candyman is the iconic score. Academy Award nominee Philip Glass provided the score, and even though he didn't care for it at first, it has grown on him. Candyman would be released first in early September 1992 at the Toronto International Film Festival, followed by a wide release on October 16th. The movie was hated by its main producer, at least until it was a success. It made nearly $26 million on its $8.5 million budget, and had a mostly good audience and critic score. The team of Siskel and Ebert were split, with Siskel likening Candyman's outfit to a blaxploitation pimp's getup, while Roger gave the film 3 out of 4 stars. This would lead to sequels that followed the laws of diminishing returns, with Candyman Farewell to Flesh being more expensive and only bringing back $13.9 million, and Candyman 3, Day of the Dead, being made for only $3 million and going straight to video. Thankfully, Todd was able to come back for a brief scene in the Candyman remake from producer Jordan Peele. Yahya Abdul-Mateen would take over the role of Candyman from Tony Todd, and he would take it graciously, saying, "Cheers to Candyman, a wonderful character that I've lived with for 25 years. He's brought grace and glory, and a beautiful boatload of friends and family. I'm honored that the spirit of Daniel Robitaille and Cabrini Green rises again. Truth to power. Blessings to the cast and crew. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for everything." So you've created a legendary horror icon. What's next? A sequel, obviously, but not just any sequel. A sequel that would conjure a brand new boogeyman. A sequel that wouldn't actually feature Candyman at all, nor the man who brought him to life, Tony Todd. When the Halloween 3 am I talking about? Well, you'll find out in today's video of what happened to Candyman. Farewell to the Flesh. Back in the early 90s, director Bernard Rose pitched the original Candyman to Propaganda Films producer Stephen Golan. Golan had low expectations for the movie and was unhappy from start to finish, especially after viewing the final product. Rose would tell Bloody Disgusting that Golan actively disliked it. As is often the case with producers, he changed his tune once the film was a financial success. Golan told Rose, "It's a great movie," or "It is now." Rose took the opportunity to ask for a straightaway sequel. It was accepted, and he was even to be paid quite a bit more than he had for Candyman, for which he still hadn't yet been compensated. Rose would come up with an idea that he called quite radical, and it was. He decided instead of making a straight-up sequel, he wanted to make Candyman 2 about the idea of Jack the Ripper haunting London in the 90s. Rose had intended to delve deeper into the Clive Barker catacombs and tell a tale in part inspired by his 1984 short story, Midnight Meat Train. Of course, this movie was eventually made into a gnarly little Bradley Cooper film in 2008, before he was Mr. Fancy Pants. Whereas Candyman dealt with race and mythos, this film was to tackle the issue of gender and eventually classism when we find out that the rich were eating the poor using Jack the... Wait a minute. Where the fuck is Tony Todd's Candyman? Exactly, he wasn't in it. Candyman wasn't a part of Candyman 2, save for a part early in the script where he's mentioned by Professor Purcell, explaining that the Ripper was like Candyman. The only part of that idea that made it somewhat into the final product. To no surprise, Golan and the studio were furious at the thought of this, and rejected the sequel full stop. In Rose's defense, he felt that he earnestly killed Candyman in the first film, and he really couldn't understand at the time why no one else acknowledged this fact. He would later change his opinion on this, saying that he wouldn't have attempted that idea today. He says he would have just made a straight-up sequel following the plight of Helen, played by actress Virginia Madsen, and Candyman himself, played by Tony Todd. Rose also offered his praises for what the next director hired, Bill Condon, was able to do with the project. Actress Virginia Madsen would tell her side of the script debacle as well, stating, "They originally wanted us to do Candyman 2, but they didn't like Bernie's idea for the sequel. They made the Candyman into a slave, which was terrible because the Candyman was educated and raised as a free man. Bernie wanted to make him like an African-American Dracula, which I think was so appealing to the African-American community because they finally had their own Dracula. The Candyman was a poet and smart. He wasn't really a monster. He was sort of that classical figure. The sequel that Bernie wanted to make was a prequel, where you see Candyman and Helen fall in love. It was turned down because the studio didn't want to have an interracial love story. Regardless, what ended up happening was a search for a new director. Enter Bill Condon. Condon, who would later go on to direct several of the Twilight films and write The Greatest Showman, had, to that point, directed a string of TV movies, including Murder 101 with Pierce Brosnan, and written projects like Strange Invaders and FX2. Though not given credit for the film, Condon says he did a lot of work on the script alongside the second writer of the movie, Mark Kruger. The two of them, working on a script originally written by the astronauts' wives, Rand Ravitch, and of course based on the work of Clive Barker. The story the three men ultimately conjured began with Professor Philip Purcell, played flamboyantly again by a memorable Michael Culkin, showing up in New Orleans on his Candyman book tour, which I should note has a totally kick-ass cover that resembles a mirror that he would look into at one of his book signings and speak the name Candyman 5 times into. He's then naturally gutted from groin to gullet in the bathroom of a bar. Candyman is back, baby. The story then follows Annie as she uncovers the truth about the origin of Candyman and his deep ties to the tragedy of her family, all the while Candyman stalks and murders those around her. Casting for the film proved to be a challenge as the script was rejected by a fair share of the actors, including A Nightmare on Elm Street 4's Tuesday Night. A huge bummer considering we could have had another Running from This Nightmare banger on the soundtrack, but I digress. Condon explained, stating, "There's an initial kind of resistance to sequels and horror films in general. So I was calling favors trying to get people like Veronica Cartwright, who I had worked with before. We saw a lot of actors and actresses. Kelly Rowan for the lead just popped out. She was wonderful. Rowan, who had previously appeared in both The Gate and Hook, would more than admirably take over the mantle as the film's lead character. But we all know who the true lead is in any Candyman movie. Screen time be damned. It's Candyman himself, Tony Todd." One can argue that Farewell to the Flesh lost some of the things in the move from Chicago to New Orleans, but one thing that always managed to stay the same was Todd's performance. Just as haunting, demanding, and regal as he had been in the original. A true professional, Todd slashed his way through Farewell to the Flesh seemingly with ease, solidifying his character as a horror icon that could keep coming back as long as the franchise built around him could keep the lights on. While that turned out to be a depressingly short amount of time, it doesn't change the fact that we all know Todd would have been great in 100 Candyman films, regardless of their quality. Though his roles were many, and his performances were often underrated, Todd managed to make every project he was in all the better for it. In the same way that Nicolas Cage has been able to create a meaningful moment in each of his films regardless of the quality surrounding him. Todd has elevated all of the material that we were fortunate enough to have him be a part of, and Farewell to the Flesh is no different. As an example of Todd's deep thought and dedication to his roles, here's what the late actor had to say about the backlash to Farewell, delving into Candyman's origins. "I insisted that we did scenes of him in his former life. Now, there are a lot of fans that don't get that, but the ones that are intelligent do. It's a gothic love story at its core. Some people go from love to love. In Helen and Daniel's case, it was the one and only, and to be punished for passionate love is unforgivable." Todd was surrounded by a large and reasonably impressive cast that included Beverly Hills Cop 3's villain, Timothy Carhart, as Annie's lovable Cajun husband, as well as an impressive performance from the aforementioned alien actress Veronica Cartwright, who plays Annie's dying mother with a major secret. Other notable faces surrounding Candyman as he murders freely are Spider-Man's Bill Nunn and Under Siege, Dark Territory's David Giannopoulos. The film is full of noteworthy character actors, including Matt Clark as someone with ties to the past, who might remind you of a Cajun Joe Bob Briggs. With the cast in shape, Condon and the crew shot equally in both Los Angeles and New Orleans. where he estimated that they spent around 20 days and many nights filming. Though Condon was a fan of how Rose turned Cabrini Green into a modern haunted house, he wanted a more traditionally gothic setting. He wanted to create an ambience that resembled the older, less corporate version of Mardi Gras. So Condon hired one of the city's lesser-used Hollywood locals, someone who had a warehouse full of old-school floats and decorations, including a pan float featuring a huge penis. A penis float that, according to Condon, can be seen in the film if you're paying close enough of attention. Condon told the Clive Barker cast that they worked with a company called Introvision on several difficult and practical special effects moments. He estimated that roughly 40% of the film was storyboarded because of the difficulty of these effects, including the slave quarters being demolished in the climax of the movie. It wasn't just special effects headaches that made bringing Farewell to the Flesh challenging. The crew were continuously running out of extras because the New Orleans environment kept beckoning them to imbibe in the fun of the city. The actors would start strong, then as the night went on, disappear into the many surrounding bars, unlikely to return. Condon elaborated, by the end of the meal break, there'd be no extras left. That became a big problem for us. People are very dedicated to having a good time down there. Then, of course, there were the actual bees, of which Condon lamented. It may have been true that they had very few stings in the first film, but in ours, I think there were unfortunately plenty of stings. It was never pleasant, especially for poor Tony Todd and stunt coordinator and Tony Todd double, Billy Washington. Despite the challenges, they were at least able to give Candyman a bit of a wardrobe upgrade. Condon noted that they gave Candyman a sleeker, sexier kind of look than the rat fur that he was wearing on his collar in the first movie. It was more of an Armani kind of look. The upgraded titular character would finally be unleashed on the world when Candyman Farewell to the Flesh swarmed to theaters nearly 3 years after its predecessor, on March 17, 1995. With an unknown budget, IMDb estimates a budget of around $6 million, but that remains unconfirmed. The film made just about that amount in its opening weekend, then closed out at nearly $14 million by the end of its theatrical run. Whether or not this was enough to turn a profit is probably answered by the fact that the sequel, Candyman 3: Day of the Dead, headed direct to video. The reviews couldn't have helped, with most critics praising Todd, but seeing the film as another unnecessary gore-fueled horror sequel. Condon didn't agree and noted that critics did realize what the film was trying to say, with its deeper themes surrounding racism, violence, and love, but simply disregarded them because it was a genre sequel, stating, "It's interesting to note that there were critics who would acknowledge all of the subtext, but would say, surely they weren't thinking about that, because it's just a slasher movie." To throw some fuel on the fire, some of the movie's marketing had landed the production in hot water. A poster marketing the film that featured Candyman standing behind his victim caused the production to be accused of trying to profit off the ongoing O.J. Simpson publicity, because it featured a black man stalking a white woman. It's easy to forget that ridiculous feigned outrage existed long before Twitter, X. Clive Barker responded to this accusation directly on a talk show when a call-in viewer asked about it. The horror legend responded, "I thought it was nonsense. We made this movie a long time ago. We made the movie that this is a sequel to a long time ago. There was no association whatsoever in our heads. I felt it more reflective of America's present preoccupation with the trial than about the advertising." Clive Barker seemed at least somewhat happy with the film itself, saying on the same show, "It has a lot of damn fine acting and good storytelling. It feels to me as though horror has become debased in the last few years, and when we talk about horror movies recently, we think about mindless pieces of bloodletting, and we've tried to do something better than that." I'd agree there are certainly things to enjoy when it comes to this sequel. Another underrated Tony Todd performance that we'll be able to forever enjoy. A horror movie that utilizes the unique setting of New Orleans, and some pretty decent kills. arguably the best sequel in the franchise. And that, my friends, is what happened to Candyman: Farewell to the Flesh. You've seen Candyman haunt Cabrini Green. You've seen Candyman terrorize his ancestors in New Orleans. Now, see Candyman as you've never seen him before. The direct-to-video shelf. Though the previous iteration, Farewell to the Flesh, had made nearly $14 million on a rumored $6 million budget, the reviews weren't exactly great, and the powers that be decided that the franchise was no longer sticky nor sweet enough for the big screen. So Candyman was banished to the direct-to-video bin with a razor-thin budget. The result would be a movie that Tony Todd was ultimately disappointed with, and Clive Barker chose not to even put his name on. A movie that would bury the Candyman franchise for the next quarter century. This is what happened to Candyman 3: Day of the Dead. After the events of Candyman: Farewell to the Flesh, series creator and legend Clive Barker seemed ready to jump back into the franchise. He told AOL at the time, "I am very proud of both the Candyman pictures, but I haven't been approached by Polygram for a third picture. Of course, it almost took 10 years for Hollywood to make a sequel to Alien, so anything is possible." Barker inexplicably wouldn't be contacted again until the film was made. The production screened the final product for him after it was already complete, and asked him to unceremoniously put his name on it anyway. Barker reacted by saying, "I decline to put my name on it. I really don't think I contributed anything to its creation, and it seems entirely phony to plunk your name on it. Take the money and run. I didn't think it was a badly created movie. I just didn't think it had anything to do with the mythology I originally created. I would have felt like a big old fake." Those who did create Candyman 3 included director Tori Meyer, who had previously directed the also direct-to-video horror film Sleepstalker. Meyer also wrote the script after previously hailing Leprechaun 2 and Carrot Top's chairman of the board. Meyer's frequent collaborator and fellow chairman of the board writer, Alfredo Septian, was also brought on board, and Candyman 3, the Skinamax sequel, was born. The story the writers would conjure found us a shocking 25 years after the events of Farewell to the Flesh, meaning this 1999 sequel would take place in 2020. There were so many red flags. So many. It's centered around Daniel Robitaille / Candyman's great-great-great-granddaughter Caroline, though you wouldn't know it by all the sexual interactions that the film puts the two in. Caroline, who is the little girl at the end of Farewell to the Flesh, is haunted by her family's past and seeming inability to ever find pants. Her mother, who is very clearly a recast actress, went through all the things that we witnessed her go through in the last film, only to succumb to Candyman after all, having her throat slit by him in her bathtub, which of course is deemed a suicide. But hey, Caroline did get some sweet paintings out of the deal. Paintings that her friend Miguel is trying to use to promote his art gallery in a trashy true crime-esque type of way. Caroline judges him, but attends the event anyway, and is naturally goaded into saying Candyman into the mirror 5 times. Because we aren't here for a TED Talk, and you know what happens next. Candyman arrives on an actually pretty kick-ass B train, and starts hooking folks through their stomachs while asking his great-great-granddaughter to be his victim. Again, in an all too sexual fashion. That's your relative, for God's sakes. The story is different than previous iterations by way of its unique supporting characters. After Candyman slaughters some friends halfway through a softcore porn scene that involves eating a honeycomb naked, the cops set their sights on Caroline's new friend David. This is because he's not white and these cops are as racist as the day is long. It's a specific point the film makes repeatedly. Seriously, these dreadful detectives remind you that they are racist more times than an infomercial tries to fit their 1-800 number in before the ad ends. David and Caroline take a bunch of sexy tequila shots together, and a romance ensues, but not before she meets his abuela, a psychic healer who is kind of scary and has a penchant for the dramatic. She has Caroline whisper her troubles into an egg, which she cracks. Inside, the yolk begins to pour out, followed by a bee, which everyone knows means that she has to find and destroy Candyman's paintings to stop him once and for all. Inconveniently, the paintings have already been stolen by a gang of roided out Good Charlotte superfans. They tie Caroline up and put her in a questionable ball gag, allowing Candyman to murder the shit out of everyone. Afterward, Candyman one more time tries to put his fingers in his great-great-great-granddaughter's mouth and makes out with her a little bit before she breaks free of his trance. She then fights off a few bees and destroys his painting, causing him to explode into a terribly filmed special effects sequence. When we say the 90s are great, we don't mean stuff like this. Finally, the bad cop shows up just in time to be shot by good cop Ernie Hudson Jr. and take the fall for the Candyman murders, getting Caroline and David quite literally off the hook, and destroying the myth of Candyman in the process. While most of this was indeed the type of horror movie that reinforced the worst stereotypes of the genre, Tony Todd was once again fantastic in the role. He had some great lines and even better kills and spots. Specifically, the murder of a prickish cop who was in what he thought was the safety of his vehicle. While you knew you could always count on Tony Todd to bring the goods, the rest of the cast also wasn't nearly as bad as you might expect. The character of David was played by the more than capable Sue Garcia, who you'll likely remember as Rod from A Nightmare on Elm Street, though he had a different name there. Garcia has a surprising amount of range and likability that no doubt contributed to his long career in acting. The leading role of Caroline went to September of 1995's Playboy Playmate of the Month, wife of Nikki Sixx, and Baywatch actress Donna DeRico. DeRico held her own in a role that asked her to do quite a bit, and at times a bit too much. The director was also impressed with her performance, saying that the studio felt that not since Jamie Lee Curtis has an actress reacted so persuasively to emotional and tangible torment. While that's an unfair comparison, the faults of Candyman 3 don't by any means rest on DeRico's shoulders. Day of the Dead was filmed in just 18 days in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles. The production was so rushed that the actors allegedly had a maximum of 2 takes before they were required to move on to the next shot. The audio commentary for the film also claims the budget was closer to $1 million than the $3 million that the studio previously boasted. The production assumed that it wouldn't be able to even rehire bee handler Norman Gary for the film. Thankfully, Gary reduced his fee to stay with the franchise and complete what he had started. You know it's bad when even the bee handler knows you're on a budget. And thank God. I'm sure the actors didn't want a guy you found on Craigslist and paid in 7-Eleven gift cards to be handling thousands of bees, which in many late 90s straight-to-video situations would have been the case. Yes, we're looking at you, Dimension Films. Though it's clear Candyman 3 was working on a budget, necessity can truly be the mother of all invention. While on set one day in Eastside Los Angeles, a group of crew members caught some graffiti artists tagging some local spots in the area and paid them each $100 to do the same to their set, giving it a touch of realism. Of the many things missing from the previous films, such as a budget or a purpose, the lack of Philip Glass's iconic score is also missing. Candyman 3 composer Adam Gorgoni had planned to use at least themes from it, but was banned from doing so as they own none of the rights and likely couldn't afford them. If you haven't yet gotten the hook that this was a film on a budget, well, let me tell you, they ran out of money before filming the opening credits. While the studio wanted to simply lay credits over top of the opening scene, the director and cinematographer were not to be denied. They instead found some equipment, blacked out the windows of a garage, and filmed the opening sequence themselves, using Candyman's prop hook, which you just know was a creepy shoot. The location screams one of the urban avant-garde settings where Candyman would have shown and started gutting folks. Candyman 3: Day of the Dead was released directly to DVD with little fanfare and even less of a response from critics. There aren't a lot of nice things to be said about the film, even these days. Even Tony Todd was famously not a fan of the film, letting fans know at Fangoria's Weekend of Horrors convention that he was disappointed with the outcome. The craziest part of Day of the Dead's legacy, however, is what it meant for the future of the franchise, or rather, lack thereof. In 2004, it was reported by Fangoria that both Tony Todd and Clive Barker were working on a big-budget standalone Candyman film that wouldn't have anything to do with its predecessor. Todd and Clive met multiple times and even storyboarded some of that film that Todd said would be set in New England. The movie would feature an image of Candyman in a blizzard and had the slasher terrorizing an all-girls school, and more specifically, a professor who was a descendant of Candyman. It was also reported that Clive Barker was working on, hold on to your boots, a Freddy vs. Jason style team-up film between Hellraiser's Pinhead and Candyman himself. We never saw either of these films for whatever reason, and the franchise would lay dormant for another 20 years after Day of the Dead, when Nia DaCosta and Jordan Peele resurrected the property in 2021. And that, my friends, is what happened to Candyman 3: Day of the Dead.
The legend is, if you say his name 5 times while looking in the mirror, he appears in the reflection.
Legacy sequels, recently they've been the talk of the town, for better and for worse. The recent Halloween trilogy seems to be beloved by some and hated by others. The new Exorcist sequel underperformed both in box office and public opinion. Yet, these types of sequels are not stopping anytime soon. One that seemed to go over mostly well with a decent box office, mostly good reviews, and generally happy fans was the 2021 release of Candyman. Of course, plenty didn't love it or thought it was trying too hard, but overall, it did okay and brought plenty of new ideas to the table while respecting the original. A lot had to happen before that legacy sequel could happen. For the longest of time, it was believed to be a remake, and fans of the original and of Tony Todd were not happy with that at all. However, things were leaking left and right that led us to believe it might be more than that. It might be something different. So, let's take a look into the history of this sequel, how it came to be, then how it did, because it did well, but could have done a lot better in the eyes of some fans. When the reboot, remake, requel, whatever, of Candyman was announced, it was easy to join into the communal groan of the horror community. Another one, and for a film that was so good, with 2 sequels already in existence, with diminishing returns to say the least, the real question was, why? Or, just why? In terms of the legacy sequels, this is certainly one of the best out there, but it didn't come easy. The original film came out in 1992 from director Bernard Rose, based on the Clive Barker story, The Forbidden. The film followed a woman, Helen Lyle, as she researched and obsessed over the legend of Candyman, or Daniel Robitaille, a man who was killed for loving the wrong woman in a heavily racist society. Of course, his legend comes to haunt her and others, creating a slasher for horror fans to fan over. The way this film was made, the time at which it came out, not long after the Rodney King beating and subsequent riots, the casting, the quality of the film, how it was adapted from the Clive Barker story, and more, there was so much involved to make it one of the scariest slashers out there. To this day, the original is still beloved and still scares people on the regular. In terms of reviews, the film seems to still be reviewed quite positively. Of course, not everyone loved it at the time or even now, but there is still something there. Tony Todd's performance counted for a lot in this and still does. He is Candyman. If we look at numbers, the original still stands with 79% from critics and 63% from users on Rotten Tomatoes. Yeah, this could be higher, but for its fans, it's a classic, and it's one that marked a generation. The popularity of Tony Todd at conventions, how often he's invited to talk about the film, how Bernard Rose still carries stills and storyboards for the film when making appearances, leads to the understanding that the film has a solid fan base. Then came the sequels, With Candyman Farewell to the Flesh in 1995, which instead of going with the story of Helen, as she is summoned after death at the end of the first, it moves the story to New Orleans and brings back Candyman in his Tony Todd form. The film once again focuses a lot on a white woman protagonist, but it mostly abandons all subtext while upping the blood and gore factor. While some seem to love it at first, it is certainly not the first, scoring 22% with critics and 30% with fans on Rotten Tomatoes. The film is not abysmal, but it doesn't really pull on the nostalgia heartstrings on its own. It mostly made its money because of its connection to the first. Farewell to the Flesh did make enough money to lead to another sequel, Candyman 3, also known as Candyman Day of the Dead. This third film came out in 1999 and is set in 2020, getting a bit futuristic on us there. The lead here is played by Donna D'Errico, who we're supposed to believe is the descendant of Daniel Robitaille, who in this story was a painter just like her, and who wants her to take on the killing mantle. This one is all about the killing and not all that much about subtext or subtlety. The gore is very much there, but not much else. The film currently stands at an abysmal 7% from critics and slightly less bad 22% from viewers on Rotten Tomatoes. It's the kind of sequel that makes fans wonder why it was made, while also making it clear that perhaps the franchise should die before it's damaged further. But, like any good slasher, Candyman could not be killed this easily. Other sequels and reboots almost happened. In the early 2000s, the original director was almost brought back for a prequel, one where the story would revolve around the love between Candyman and Helen, something that probably would have made a few get that puzzled puppy look. Helen and Candyman in love? A prequel? Were they implying that Helen was the love that led him to be killed? Because that would have been a more interesting story than that third film, but it would not have been Helen. The studio quickly said nope to that, and the sequel churning machine had to find another idea. Then comes Freddy vs. Jason, and it's money. Every slasher killer was almost put in a film like this. Pinhead, Michael Myers, they even thought of bringing in Ash from the Evil Dead franchise to face some of them. Of course, Candyman was not left behind on this, and a proposed Candyman vs. Leprechaun started making the rounds. Tony Todd had zero interest in this, thankfully, saying, "I will never be involved in something like that." So that died before it was much more than a concept. In 2004, there was a version of Candyman that was doing the rounds, with Clive Barker attached and a $25 million budget. It was to be a fourth film in the franchise, and Tony Todd confirmed it to Fangoria. As we now know, that also died not long after its announcement. In 2009, another plan was announced, possibly for the same sequel, but with Deon Taylor attached to direct. The film would take place after the second one and ignore Day of the Dead. The story for this one moved Candyman to winter in the Northeast, in college for women, where he would get plenty of potential victims and really become just another slasher without much else to him. Another sequel that thankfully went nowhere and subsequently disappeared. Then we got almost a decade of silence on a potential sequel or reboot for the hooked arm man of our nightmares. Then, in 2018, word started circulating that Jordan Peele wanted to reboot the series. The man had already jumped into the deep end in the horror genre with the well-received and award-winning Get Out, and his new film, Us, was just about to see the light of projectors. He seemed like a solid choice, something Tony Todd agreed with, saying, "I'd rather have him do it, someone with intelligence who's going to be thoughtful and dig into the whole racial makeup of who the Candyman is and why he existed in the first place." That's an embrace for the creator that meant fans could get on board too. In November of the same year, it was confirmed that Peele would be making a new Candyman, which he would co-produce with Win Rosenfeld and Nia DaCosta directing. All three were to write the script together. Of course, from then on, it became known as Jordan Peele's Candyman, something folks still think of when the film comes up in conversation and online. While he's a large part of the film, as he co-produced and co-wrote it, the name that should come up with the title more often is who most people view as the creative driving force behind a movie, the director, who in this case is Nia DaCosta. Yes, Peele was involved at many stages, but there's something here that is very much DaCosta's. When the film was released, her name seemed to be in the shadows more than it should have been. That is, until the box office came in. The attention suddenly focused on DaCosta as the first black woman to get a #1 box office hit. Suddenly, those who didn't seem to be able to be bothered about learning her name were all about her. Another thing we must touch upon here is the film's teaser trailer. It was magnificent. The shadow puppets were genius and were used again in the film to fill in what normally would have been flashbacks, giving these a style reminiscent of artist Cara Walker's work about racism and violence, something she does with powerful silhouette cutouts. Here, the work was done by a puppet theatre company called Manuel Cinema, based out of Chicago. These became sort of legends instead of flashback, a great way to handle a story like that of Daniel Robitaille and the other men who became Candyman. As for the film itself, the story is definitely a sequel. It centres around Anthony McCoy, an artist whose work is about to gain much more traction in the Chicago art world due to his new connection to the Candyman story. Here, the Candyman we first meet is not Daniel Robitaille, but Sherman Fields, a man beaten to death in the 1970s for being suspected of giving candy to a kid that had a razor blade in it. This, of course, is based on an urban legend, perfect to create the film's own new legend. The Candyman here becomes a being that represents more than one man, but men who are wrongfully killed and looking for vengeance, and/or justice. McCoy soon starts researching the legend, and it influences his work as an artist, but also affects his personality and his body. From there, the legend grows, and the film takes off. The movie touches on some of the themes of the original, with black oppression, police violence, racism, and how legends, urban or otherwise, are born and can affect society, even the white saviour aspect. But it also modernises the stakes and the themes, adding in themes of gentrification, the use of art to pass a hard message, the need for heroes or anti-heroes to represent all people, how history and what we know of it evolves, and the importance of voices from one's community in telling its stories. The original story's by a white man, but there was something in how Clive Barker wrote it and how Bernard Rose directed it that worked. Also, the original film is very much centred on the white woman putting herself in the story of black people and wanting very much to become a saviour. There is something to be studied in how this is approached and put on film. Here, the sequel is made with some of the same ideas, some of the same characters even, but handled differently. This new Candyman film is indeed a sequel, but it has something to say, something new to bring to the table, while also giving fans some of what they expect. There is a bit of fan service in the story, giving the character William Burke the book Weave World by Clive Barker to have with him in the laundromat where McCoy meets him, naming the art dealer Clive Privler as a nod to Barker as well, and having the character be gay and in an interracial relationship mirror some of Barker's life and past relationships. The fact that McCoy is a painter can also be connected to Barker, whose paintings sell for thousands of dollars to collectors. Of course, McCoy himself is a bit of a fan service, as we discover while watching the film that he's the baby that Helen saves at the end of the original film. His mother, Anne-Marie McCoy, is even played by the same actress as in the first film, Vanessa Williams. Then there's Cabrini Green, the location from the first film being the same here but gentrified, so what used to be the projects is now a series of condo buildings, all shiny and new, except for one fenced-off section which dates back to the 1940s that gets to be seen here. And of course, the connections to Daniel Robitaille, the man we know as the original Candyman, and the fact that the film did indeed bring back Tony Todd for a short few minutes as a sort of vision, where he's de-aged by way of CGI to match his 1992 looks. This alone was enough to give chills to some fans in the theatres.
Tell everyone.
Also, references to Helen are made. She's mentioned as we get to hear her voice, she's on a newspaper article, but also the scenes in the high-rise apartment have a large resemblance to Helen in some of the angles, and the scenes that were only in the trailer of a woman in church wearing Helen's burial dress and flower wreath. There are other more subtle details of course, and somehow these references and homages do not feel overdone, being easily missed in some cases, tying the film to the first without screaming at you, "Look, aren't we clever?" like many other legacy sequels seem to have done lately. In terms of numbers, this new Candyman has an 84% critics rating and a 72% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It was made for about $22 million and made almost $77.5 million in total worldwide box office. So, not bad at all. Especially considering it had its release pushed back 3 times from its original release date of June the 12th, 2020, which was during the pandemic, to a first new date of September 25, 2020, then to October 16th, 2020, which was supposed to be another Legacy sequel's release date, with Halloween Kills. Then it got the final push back to August 27th, 2021. Considering the film was released on VOD just a couple of weeks later on September 17th, 2021, that box office shows a strong outing. Overall, this Legacy sequel does things right, taking the themes of the original, adding its own, avoiding the traps of going the cheap gore and blood only route. It respects its origins and makes the most of the connections with them, avoiding the other sequels without fully cancelling them from the universe. It takes what makes sense to take and gives new meaning to the legends, building upon them and connecting them to current issues. There is a lot here, and the film still manages to be spooky and creepy with some serious tension. Not everyone loves it, of course, but it clearly is doing decently for many.
When you say the name Candyman, the names that often come up are Tony Todd and Clive Barker. It's no surprise, as the writer and actor have made quite the impact on the horror genre. But really, it's writer and director Bernard Rose whose fingerprints are all over the original Candyman, and he played such a pivotal part in the shaping of the film that it's hard to say if it would have had the success that it did have without him. His involvement in the series stopped at the original, and seems like a big reason why the 2 sequels, Farewell to Flesh and Day of the Dead, failed to really connect in any meaningful way. So it's extremely intriguing to know that Rose had actually wanted to make a sequel himself. But to say that it would have been controversial would have been a bit of an understatement, as it moved on from the United States, moved on from the Mirror, and even excluded a pretty darn important character, making this one of the more baffling films we've ever covered in this series. So join us for what the f*** happened to this unmade horror movie as we take a look at Bernard Rose's Candyman, The Midnight Meat Train. Yes, I know. Didn't we already get a story called Midnight Meat Train that was written by Clive Barker? And yes, you're right, we did. And there was a 2008 film that starred Bradley Cooper and Vinnie Jones and was about a serial killer who stalked late-night train commuters. But Rose's original script simply shared the name and concept of a train car filled with body parts and blood. So if you're worried we're just going to be talking about a slightly different version of that Midnight Meat Train, don't. And before we can get into this supposed sequel, we should talk about the origins.
We had a deal.
Surrender to me now, and he shall be unharmed.
The original Candyman was written by Bernard Rose and based on the story The Forbidden by Clive Barker. It follows graduate student Helen Lyle, who is studying urban legends for her thesis. She focuses in on the legend of Candyman that exists in the nearby Cabrini Green housing project. The legend says that if you say his name into a mirror 5 times, Candyman will appear and gut you. Helen gets entrenched in the legend and eventually is killed, along with the supposedly mythical being. We get a nice little tease of Helen becoming the new Candyman herself and going after her cheating ex. The direction you could take the Candyman sequel feels fairly obvious, but Bernard Rose has never taken the common approach. Rose had taken the story of The Forbidden from its England setting and brought it to the projects of Chicago. This worked out splendidly as the projects were such a unique setting for a horror film, especially with the added social commentary. So, continuing his outside-the-box approach, Rose decided that for the sequel, he would take it back to England. And while the first spoke on race, he wanted this to speak more on gender. And you know who else had something to say on gender? Old Jack the Ripper. Rose found himself fascinated by the idea of the first boogeyman, and in his mind, that was Jack the Ripper. He had killed his victims in such brutal ways, caused mass hysteria to spread throughout the city, and still remained uncaught. So Rose felt that he was perfect. His script had the Ripper killings starting up again in England, with whorish women being murdered in alleys. We follow a British policewoman who's investigating the murders. Rose felt that it was important to continue having a female protagonist, especially since the murderer is specifically targeting women. It adds to the tension and the dread. This policewoman starts discovering very strange things during the course of the investigation, and it appears that more people are involved in this than she previously thought. There's a much larger conspiracy at play, and it even involves the royals. In a lot of ways, the story sounds very similar to From Hell, the Alan Moore graphic novel that was eventually adapted into a Johnny Depp film. While that story obviously dealt with the actual Jack the Ripper killer, and this one was more present day, the concept of a conspiracy around the murders and people wanting to cover it up and protect the monarch is still ever present. There's a lot of times when reading through this and it just feels like you're reading through From Hell. The finale would have featured the titular meat train pulling into a secret station beneath Buckingham Palace. This is where it's revealed that members of the royal family are feasting on naked women. So ultimately, the stories of Jack the Ripper end up not being true and are simply the imagination of theorists. The Ripper is simply a murderer that's killing these women so that they can be feasted on. That's it. But I'm sure you're thinking, you sure have mentioned Jack the Ripper and the meat train a lot, but where's Candyman? Which makes sense as this is supposed to be a Candyman sequel. But prepare to be disappointed as he doesn't appear in this film at all. Yeah, that's right. Rose felt that Candyman had died at the end of the original, and that they could simply follow a different boogeyman, or as Rose often referred to him as, a ghost. But that logic quickly falls apart with the entire ending and twist. So I'm really not sure what Rose was going for here. Is the Ripper a boogeyman, or is it just a killer getting food for his masters? It doesn't even seem like Rose himself knows. Funnily enough, upon reflection, Rose actually thinks that he got the sequel wrong, just as the actual makers of the real sequel had. Because the first film was a story of Helen becoming a monster, and yet none of the sequels focused on her, instead diving into the family history of the Candyman himself. So Rose would have corrected that and followed her as the main villain of the story. Could you imagine that? Getting a full film of the ending of one? That sounds amazing. It's hard to hear Rose's original pitch and take it seriously. As a big fan of the original, I couldn't imagine going to a Candyman movie and not even getting the hook-handed killer. The change of setting and villain make it feel more like a writer and director who's being forced to make a sequel that he doesn't want to, which was pretty much what was happening. And so thankfully, this script was quickly trashed and the producers moved on. Unfortunately, what we received instead was 1995's Farewell to Flesh, which got rid of the interesting social and racial commentary and made Candyman a straight-up slasher villain. I love slashers as much as the next guy, but Candyman was a smart man's killer. So to see him devolve so quickly into a joke was simply sad. 1999's Day of the Dead didn't do much better and effectively killed the series. In the aftermath of Freddy vs. Jason, there were rumors about Candyman vs. Hellraiser, but thankfully Clive Barker immediately shot that idea down. Tony Todd has talked several times about a winter Candyman film set at a girls' university during a snowstorm, but with the complicated rights issues, no sequel was ever approached. Thankfully, once Get Out released and took the world by storm, Jordan Peele was given the keys to the horror kingdom. And what property did he have his sights on revamping? Well, you already know. Nia DaCosta shot her own version of Candyman in 2021. While this movie serves as both a requel and a direct sequel to the original, it failed to connect with audiences in a significant way, which is really too bad, as star Yahya Abdul-Mateen is a phenomenal actor, and the franchise would have been better off with him involved. The ownership of the Candyman property has been a pretty complicated one. While Clive Barker may have created the character in his original short story, Propaganda first owned the rights to the film. This then shifted to Sony, then to Columbia, then all the way to Artisan. Artisan would eventually become Lionsgate. Nowadays, the rights lay with MGM, and after the recent acquisition by Amazon, means we could see a new Candyman coming to Prime before too long. Whether that's the Yahya Abdul-Mateen version, Tony Todd, or even an entirely different one is anyone's guess. But it does seem as though we're not too far off from getting one. So go to your bathroom, look in the mirror, and say his name 5 times, and maybe you'll get a role in the sequel yourself. I mean, hey, every good slasher has an opening kill.
Tell everyone.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.